The last way that we're going to solve quadratic equations is with the quadratic formula. So by the end of this lesson, that's what you should be able to do. So the awesome thing about a quadratic equation is, or about the quadratic formula, is that every quadratic equation can be solved with it. It's kind of big, it's a lot to remember, but it works every single time. So let's say we have a quadratic equation in standard form. It has to look like this. We're going to pull out the a value, the b value, and the c value, and then plug it into this giant equation right here. And this equation says that x equals, so our answer is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. You need to memorize this. I will not give this to you on a test or a quiz. So here's some things to help you remember. So a bad boy couldn't decide whether or not to go to a radical party. This is the negative b. Couldn't decide, plus or minus, radical party, like a radical, square root. But he was being a square and got turned down, so negative, by 4 awesome chicks, 4AC. And it was all over by 2 a.m., all divided by 2a. And then I just find this one funny. Somebody graffitied the quadratic formula, and then someone responded, "Some thugs just want to watch the world learn." So use the quadratic formula to solve each equation. The first thing you need to do is make sure that it's in standard form, which means get everything over to the left side and have it equal 0. Once that happens, pick out your a, b, and c. A is always next to x squared, b is always next to x, and c doesn't have a letter on it. So my value in front of x squared is 1, my value in front of x is negative 2, and my value without an x is 8. Write down the quadratic formula every single time. This will help it stick into your head, and eventually you won't need to do this, but the more you write it down, the more you see it, the more you'll remember it. So then we just plug stuff in. And this is the opposite of b, so x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times a times c, and it's all divided by 2 times a. Now I know people hate showing work, but show your work on this. It will help you avoid mistakes. So the opposite of negative 2 is positive 2, plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared is 4. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 8 is a positive 32, not 24. And it's all divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. So if we keep simplifying, we get the square root of 36, which we know is a perfect square. And then this is basically 2 problems here. We have one where we have to do 2 plus 6 and divide that by 2. And then there's another one where we have to do 2 minus 6 and divide that by 2. So remember, anytime you take the square root of something, you have a plus or minus, and the quadratic formula puts that into the actual formula. So if we solve the first one, 2 plus 6 is 8, divided by 2, one of our answers is 4. 2 minus 6 is negative 4, and if we divide that by 2, we get negative 2. So our 2 answers are 4 and negative 2. So let's try another one. This one here, the first thing we have to do is get it into standard form. So I need to move this 117 over to the other side. So I end up with x squared minus 4x minus 117 equals 0. So now that it's in standard form, I can pick out the things that I'm going to plug into the quadratic formula. My value in front of x squared is 1. My b value is negative 4. And my c is negative 117. So write it out again. I know it's on this page already, but like I said, the more you write it down, the better it will stick. And then plug stuff in. So x equals negative 4 plus or minus negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 117. and it's all divided by 2 times 1. So then we start simplifying. X equals positive 4 plus or minus the square root of 16. And then if you do negative 4 times 1 times negative 117, you end up with 468. And it's all divided by 2. So we get 4 plus or minus the square root of 484, all divided by 2. And lucky for us, the square root of 484 is a perfect square. It's 22. And then remember, this means we technically have two different problems here. We have one where we have to add 4 and 22 and then cut them in half, and then one where we have to subtract 4 and 22 and cut them in half. So this first one, we end up with 13, and the second one, we end up with negative 9. So my two answers for this are positive 13 and negative 9. So it really doesn't get any harder than this. Besides, you might get something that isn't a perfect square. And that's why we learned chapter 11 before we did this, so that we can put things into simplest radical form. So let's skip this problem for now and work on this one. So it's already in standard form, so the first thing I need to do is pick out what I'm going to plug in. So I'm going to plug in 7 for A, negative 2 for B, and negative 8 for C. So write out the quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. And then we can start plugging stuff in. Opposite of negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 7 times negative 8. And divide that by 2 times 7. So we get a positive 2 out front, plus or minus the square root of 4. And if you do negative 4 times 7 times negative 8, you end up with positive 224. And it's all divided by 14. So combine what's inside the square root and you end up with 228. And then we have to break this down. Now the square root of 228 is not a perfect square. It's 15.09 blah 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 blah. So think back to what we did with radicals. If I gave you 228, you should be able to break this down and find its squares. So 228, a 2 goes into it, and it goes in 114 times. And then 2 goes into 114, 57 times. And then fortunately for us, 57 is a prime number, so we can't break that down anymore. So we can make a square of 2's, and 57's got to stay inside. So instead of writing 228, I'm going to write this as 2 plus or minus 2 root 57. And that's all divided by 14. Unfortunately, we are not done. On the top, those two things that we have a 2 in common. So I can factor out a 2 from the top. And I'm left with 1 plus or minus 1 times the square root of 57. So I can just write 57. And it's all divided by 14. And 14 is really just 2 times 7. So just like we did with the rationals, because we have multiplication and we got the same thing on top and bottom, we can cross it off. So the simplified answer, what I want to see on tests and quizzes, is 1 plus or minus the square root of 57 divided by 7. And if I asked you for an approximation of this, you could plug it into your calculator. You'd do 1 plus the square root of 57 divided by 7, and then 1 minus the square root of 57 divided by 7. But I want you to leave them in simplest radical form. So this is the type of answer that I want to see. So there are tons of methods that we learned. Graphing we haven't done yet, but square roots you can only use if it doesn't have an x term. So something like 3x squared plus 9 equals 0, we could take the square root of it. Factoring, I would only use if you can factor it easily. Like if you had something like x squared plus 10x plus 21. Add to make 10, multiply to make 21, it'd be 7 and 3, it'd be really easy. Completing the square works all the time. This says use if the x squared term is 1, but I don't mind using it when the x squared term is not 1. The quadratic formula works all the time, just like completing the square, but to me the quadratic formula is a lot to plug stuff into, so I tend to use that as a last resort. Remember, on your quiz, you will need to know how to graph, or how to solve something all 4 ways, and then there'll be a couple where you get to choose. So I'm leaving one for you to do. It's actually the same one that we did yesterday with completing the square, so double check your answers and make sure you ended up with the same thing. Write down any questions you have, and we can go over them in class tomorrow. Enjoy your night.